Okay. Good morning, everybody. Let me just see that okay. Okay. Good morning, everyone that's coming on. We are going to be doing a summary of chapter 2 in Tanya today. Chapter 1 was an introduction to what Tanya is all about, which is basically the alignment of our values and our actions. We were introduced to the tzaddik, the Benoni, and the Rasha. And we also were introduced to the concepts of kedusha, which is holiness, which does not obstruct godliness in any way. It reveals godliness. And we were introduced to the concept of klippa, which conceals godliness. And we were also introduced to the animal soul of a Jew, which comes from something called klippas noiga, which is a category that is neither kedusha, but it is also not complete unholiness. There is some translucent holiness within that we can actually, by our intent, either elevate the klippa to a level of kedusha, or unfortunately, by our actions, also it can descend into complete klippa. This chapter, chapter 2, we are actually introduced now to the godly soul. Now, the reason why we are actually introduced firstly to the animal soul and then to the godly soul, one would think actually that it should be different. We should first meet our godly soul, right? The reason why we are introduced first and foremost to the animal soul, because by the order of things, the animal soul comes into our body first, because the animal soul is actually what gives us life. So at the moment of birth, the animal soul comes into our body. And as we know, the animal soul is really all about survival and self-preservation, and really is very selfish and just thinks of itself, right? And therefore, the animal soul, the baby, starts crying right away. He wants to eat, he wants to be changed, he wants to sleep, he wants to be held, because it's all about me, and self-preservation, and how do I actually survive. And of course, we know that when, at the time of the bris for a boy, at the time of naming for a girl, the godly soul then comes into the person partially. Why do we say partially? Because it actually completely comes into the person at the time of bar or bas mitzvah, at which time the person therefore has complete bechira, complete choice, because complete choice is not really considered a true choice if the animal soul is stronger than the godly soul and if they're not equals. At the time of bar and bas mitzvah, a person becomes responsible for his or her actions, because then godly soul completely comes into the person, and the person has complete choice. That is not written in this parak of Tanya, but it is. This is just to explain why we actually talk about the godly soul second and not first. So let us meet our godly soul in this chapter of Tanya, and there's a lot of information in this chapter. So first of all, the Alter Rebbe tells us, where does the godly soul come from, and what is it? So he starts off this parak by telling us that the godly soul is a chelek Eloka mima'al mamash, that it is a part of Hashem above truly. And he actually quotes what we say in the morning brachas, and it's a song that has been made famous over the last year as well, when we thank Hashem for our soul. Now, we do know that the first thing we say in the morning is Moed Ani, we thank Hashem for our soul, but Moed Ani does not contain Hashem's name, and that is because we say it even before we purify our hands by washing them through Negelbasser. But there is a prayer afterwards that is basically the same content of Moed Ani to a greater degree, which in the times of the Gemara, the people would say when they would wake up in the morning. They would not say Moed Ani, they were purer than we are today, and they would go right into saying Elokai neshama shenasata bi tahirahi. What is the meaning of this prayer? Hashem, the soul that you gave me is pure, and we are referring to the divine soul. Ata barasa, you created it. Ata yatzarta, you formed it. Ve'ata nafachta bi, and you blew it in me. So firstly, we have two souls. That's number one. A Jew has two souls, the Alter Rebbe tells us. Number two, how did the soul come into being? When Hashem created Adam and he gave him a godly soul, Hashem blew the soul into him. Now, what does that mean that Hashem blew the soul into him? Hashem actually created the entire world through speech. Now, we know this on a very, very simple level because in the Chumash, we read about the 6 days of creation, and we see that Hashem said, Yehi ar, let there be light, Yehi rakia, let there be a firmament. Everything was through speech. And speech is considered the exterior part of Hashem. In the second part of Tanya, Shar HaYichud VaEmunah, there the Alter Rebbe goes into great detail about the speech and also sometimes in this first part of Tanya. But for now, it's important for us to know that speech is considered the exterior part of Hashem, whereas thought is the interior, just like in a person. What you are thinking is closer to your brain. I can't even tell what you're thinking. It's only when you speak that it goes out of you. So it's the exterior part of you. So all created beings come from Hashem's speech, but the godly soul of a Jew is the only creation that comes from Hashem's thought. In other words, from inside of Hashem. And what does the concept of blowing the neshama into us have to do with this? Well, when we speak, we can speak and speak and speak, especially us women, right? We can speak for a long time and not get tired. But if we were to blow, if we were to go, we would actually tire very easily because the blowing of the breath comes from a deeper part inside of us. So when we thank Hashem for blowing the soul into us, we are actually thanking Hashem for giving us the soul from the interior part of Hashem, from a part that is much, much deeper within Hashem. And the Alter Rebbe brings an example of a child who is born and compares the neshama that Hashem gives us to the birth of the child that originates from the father's brain. Now, how does a child originate from the father's brain? The father had a thought. The thought became a drop of semen. The semen impregnated the mother. That drop of semen, which originated in the father's brain, now goes through a whole gestation period of 9 months and becomes different parts of a body, the hands, the feet, the nose, the eyes, the mouth, even the toenails and the fingernails of a person originate from the thought of the father. So in the same way, the neshama comes from the intellect, the thought of Hashem. And the neshama also has to go through a period of gestation before it comes down into this world. It cannot simply go directly from Hashem's thought and land into a body. The gestation period of a neshama is actually the descent of the neshama from Hashem through, firstly, the 4 spiritual worlds. And by the way, if these are new concepts to you, we're going to be repeating them many times during learning Tanya, and you will become more familiar with them. But the gestation period of a neshama means that the neshama descends directly from Hashem through, firstly, the 4 spiritual worlds of Atzilus, Bria, Yetzira, and Asiya, which is the world of emanation, the world of formation, the world of creation, and the world of action. Then the neshama descends through the 10 attributes, which are the 10 spheres of Hashem, which will be discussed in greater detail in the next parak. And finally, the neshama descends into the body of a baby that is born. Now, interestingly enough, the source of all the neshamas are the same. The source is Hashem. But the development of the neshama is just like the gestation of a child. A child, every child that is born is different, has different characteristics, has different physical characteristics, emotional characteristics, and therefore there are different levels of souls in the body, which is Bnei Yisrael. We are, the whole nation of Israel is considered to be a body. And within this body, there's a brain, and there are eyes, and a nose, and a mouth, and ears, and etc., etc. In this body, there are higher level souls and lower level souls. Just like the body of a child, all the bodies that come into this world have the same origin, the same source, which is in the drop of seed, the drop of semen, which originates in the father's brain. But the souls, much like a child which goes through gestation, the souls are affected by the descent into this world, the descent through something which is called Seder Hashtalshalus, the order of creation, which is the 4 spiritual worlds and the 10 godly attributes. But, and here's something that the Alter Rebbe introduces so beautifully in this parak, through connecting with the brain, we remain connected to our source. So we are all parts of this one big body called the nation of Israel, which are all souls which originate from Hashem. However, in this body, if we want to be connected to our source, some of us are feet, some of us are hands, some of us are fingernails. If we want to be connected to our source, we have to be connected to the brain of the body. Just like in a body, if the hand becomes disconnected from the brain, it ceases to work. If your feet are not in alignment with the brain, they don't walk. So in order for us to be connected to our source, we have to connect, says the Alter Rebbe, to the brain. The brain is the tzaddik. The tzaddik is the brain of the entire body, because the tzaddik was not affected by the descent into this world. And that's why by connecting to a tzaddik, we can connect to our source. So it's like in a child, right? When a child grows and develops, us as well, we appear not to be connected to the brain of our father, right? When a child is born, you don't see obviously the connection between him and the brain of his father, right? But also the neshama, when it descends into this world, it appears that we are disconnected. This is actually later on in Tanya, the Alter Rebbe will explain that this is actually a reason why we sin, because we forget about our connection to Hashem, and because it appears that we are independent. But if we want to connect with our source right off the bat, Alter Rebbe tells us what the solution is. When we connect to a tzaddik, we connect to the source which has not undergone any transformation. And that's why we're all important parts of this body, but we have to connect to the tzaddik in order to connect to our God, to our godly soul, not only our godly soul, but to the source of our godly soul. Now the godly soul is the same source for everybody, but influences each person to a greater degree. Another thing that the Alter Rebbe says in this chapter, so if you notice, the Alter Rebbe introduces us, first of all, to the godly soul and tells us that the godly soul, unlike the animal soul, comes from Kedusha, comes from Hashem, right? He then tells us that the godly soul is directly connected to Hashem, and in order for us to always maintain this connection, we have to connect ourselves to a tzaddik. And then the Alter Rebbe introduces the concept of the garments of a soul. The garments of the soul are actually going to be discussed in greater detail in chapter 4. But the garments of the soul now, the Alter Rebbe says, something very, very interesting and practical as well, and that is that the garments of the soul, which we know to be machshava, dibur, and maaseh, the way the soul expresses itself, which is through thought, speech, and action, which is going to be discussed in greater detail in chapter 4. The garments of the soul are something that we can influence. We do not have a choice, and we do not have an influence over what kind of a soul we receive. In other words, the source of the souls are all the same, but the kinds of souls, like we don't have a choice of a hand, a foot, a nose, a mouth, etc., in this big, big body. So therefore, it's important to connect to the brain. But what we can control is the garments of the soul. How do we control the garments of the soul? Through sanctifying ourselves at the time of conception. And this is very, very interesting, because this obviously means that a person who is born b'tahara has holier garments, but this does not mean that someone who is not born b'tahara can't change their garments, right? Because just like we, if we don't like our clothes, we go out and we buy other clothes. So too we can work on our garments, but it does happen to be that the garments of the soul are a gift that parents can give their children at the time of conception, and it has to do with what the father and the mother is thinking at the time of conception. Why thinking? Because when we speak about garments of the soul, machshava, thought, is the garment that is closest and has the most influence on the soul. Dibur is further away, Masa is even further away, action is even further away. So therefore, the Alter Rebbe gives us another little tip over here that we can use. This is not to say that if a person did not have that privilege, they cannot do it for themselves. They can, but for the future, for our future children, it's important to realize that sanctifying ourselves at the time of conception does affect the garments of the soul. And that, in a nutshell, is chapter 2. Interestingly enough, I just want to point out that when the Alter Rebbe tells us about the description of the soul and where it comes from, that it's a chelek eloka mima'al. Mima'al is a very, very interesting word, because we know that the word al means above. Me'al is like above the above. Mima'al is above the above what is above. So our godly souls really, really, really come down to from a very lofty place. The rest of Tanya is going to explain to us how to access the guidance of that godly soul, and not to let the animal soul dominate our body and our choices. But here, the Alter Rebbe says the easiest way to do that and to connect with your source is connect with a tzaddik. And because the tzaddik has an untarnished descent into this world. Okay, are there any questions? Or observations?
Hello. What do you, when you just said that about sanctifying yourself at the time of conception, I don't understand, what are you meant to be thinking? That sounds like a very,
Okay, so that is actually not written in Tanya, but it is written in other holy books, like the Shalah HaKadosh writes that at the time of conception. And again, this is it's a very large topic, so I don't want to cause any misunderstanding about this topic. But at the time of the actual conception, one is recommended to actually visualize the face of a tzaddik. I hope that helps. Okay, I'm going to end the recording.